For decades, a small Caribbean island wielded geopolitical power that defied its size. Cuba's bearded guerrilla fighters inspired student movements from Paris to Mexico City. Its intelligence services infiltrated America's government agencies at the highest levels. But today, cornered by the United States and suffocating from economic mismanagement, this once defiant revolutionary power faces an uncertain future. The story begins with the Cuban Revolution and Fidel Castro's rise to power in 1959. When the U.S. imposed an embargo and plotted Castro's overthrow, he turned to the Soviet Union, which became Cuba's lifeline. With Soviet backing, Castro and his brother Raul built an outsized military establishment that projected unprecedented power across 3 continents during the Cold War. In 1961, the CIA trained about 1,400 Cuban exiles to invade Cuba at the Bay of Pigs on the southern coast. But Castro's forces were waiting. After 3 days of fierce fighting, Cuban troops defeated the invaders, who had run out of ammunition and never received promised American air support. It was a resounding Cuban victory and a humiliating blow to U.S. prestige. Emboldened by success at home, Castro looked outward to spread revolution across the developing world. In the 1960s, the iconic Argentine guerrilla Che Guevara led Cuban-backed operations in Africa, attempting to ignite Marxist uprisings in places like the Congo. These early adventures laid groundwork for Cuba's most ambitious overseas interventions. The real commitment came in the 1970s and 1980s in Angola. When a Soviet-backed Marxist government faced a South African-supported insurgency, Cuba dispatched tens of thousands of troops. In total, more than 400,000 Cuban military and support personnel served across Africa, one of the largest deployments ever by any developing nation during the Cold War. Cuba's soldiers prevented apartheid South Africa from toppling Angola's government. Cuban forces weren't limited to Angola. They supported Ethiopia in repelling a Somali invasion. They aided rebels in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Hundreds fought alongside Algeria against Morocco. These operations were costly in blood and treasure, but they gave Cuba influence and prestige that rivaled far larger nations. In 1973, when the Middle East erupted in the Yom Kippur War, Cuba sent an armored brigade equipped with Soviet T-62 tanks to reinforce Syria. Between 800 and 3,000, Cuban troops deployed thousands of miles from home to fight on another continent. Cuban manned tanks engaged Israeli forces in direct combat. The operation cost Cuba dearly, about 180 soldiers killed and 250 wounded before the brigade withdrew. While fighting abroad, Cuba also exported revolutionary ideology across Latin America. The U.S. backed repressive military dictatorships throughout the hemisphere, but Cuba provided training, weapons, intelligence, and funds to guerrilla movements and student groups from Central America to Argentina. The island became the hemisphere's champion of leftist revolution, positioning itself as the alternative to American-backed authoritarianism. Cuba's greatest success in Latin America came in Nicaragua. For years, Havana supported Sandinista guerrillas fighting brutal dictator Anastasio Somoza. In 1979, the Sandinista revolution succeeded, and Somoza fled. But the Castros weren't finished with him. A year later in Paraguay, Somoza was assassinated in his car, an operation that the Sandinista government and Cuba trained and supported. It demonstrated Havana's reach and ruthlessness. Not every Cuban revolutionary adventure succeeded. Che Guevara, the iconic Argentine who helped Castro seize power, wanted to replicate that success in Bolivia. In the mid-1960s, he led a small guerrilla band into the Bolivian highlands. The CIA backed local government forces who hunted him relentlessly. In 1967, Guevara was captured and executed, a massive symbolic and strategic defeat for Cuba's revolutionary ambitions. Despite Guevara's death, Cuban support for leftist groups continued across Latin America for decades. Some organizations that received Cuban training and support are still fighting today. Colombia's National Liberation Army, born partly from Cuban inspiration, remains active. This network of influence, once nurtured by Havana, outlasted the Cold War itself and demonstrated the enduring reach of Cuban ideology. In 1983, the U.S. directly confronted Cuban forces in the Caribbean island of Grenada. The Reagan administration, alarmed by expanding Cuban influence in the region, invaded with 8,000 troops. They encountered nearly 800 Cubans on the island, mostly armed construction workers building an airport that American officials feared could become a Soviet military base. The operation cost Cuba 25 killed, 59 wounded, and 638 captured. It was a humbling moment for Cuban invincibility. In the 1990s and 2000s, Cuba found a new ally in Venezuelan strongman Hugo Chavez. Havana provided ideological inspiration and strategic guidance as Chavez consolidated power. When Nicolás Maduro succeeded Chavez, Cuban influence deepened further. Cuba became essential to Venezuela's notorious security and intelligence apparatus, the secret police networks that kept Maduro's regime intact and suppressed dissent. While projecting military power abroad, Cuba's intelligence services were simultaneously working inside the United States itself. Cuban spies were remarkably effective at recruiting American government officials to spy for Havana. These weren't mercenaries. Cuba lacked the money to pay spies. Instead, they were Americans who believed in the Cuban Revolution and were willing to betray their country out of ideological commitment. One of Cuba's most valuable American assets was Ana Belén Montes, a Defense Intelligence Agency analyst who spied for Cuba for 16 years. For 8 of those years, she was the DIA's senior analyst on Cuba itself. Colleagues called her the Queen of Cuba for her encyclopedic knowledge of the island's military and political systems. She had access to some of America's most sensitive intelligence about the Caribbean and Latin America. Another Cuban intelligence success was Manuel Rocha, who worked for the U.S. State Department for 20 years while secretly reporting to Havana. His career culminated in a posting as U.S. ambassador to Bolivia, giving him access to high-level diplomatic and intelligence information. Throughout 2 decades, Rocha handed over secrets because he sympathized with Cuba's revolution. Both Montes and Rocha eventually faced federal prison sentences when discovered. In January 2026, just months ago, the Trump administration delivered a devastating blow. U.S. Special Forces raided Nicolás Maduro's military headquarters in Caracas and captured the Venezuelan strongman. In the raid, 32 Cuban soldiers and intelligence officers who were part of Maduro's security detail were killed. Cuban military personnel died in a foreign land while protecting a target the U.S. was eliminating. But the consequences went far deeper than those deaths. For years, Venezuela had shipped oil to Cuba as part of their alliance. Those shipments were vital to the Cuban economy, providing fuel and resources that kept the regime afloat. With Maduro gone and a new Venezuelan government in place, those oil deliveries stopped entirely. Cuba lost not just a regional ally but its economic oxygen. The island faced severe shortages of fuel, food, and basic supplies. Cuba's collapse accelerated rapidly after Maduro's fall. Decades of economic mismanagement had already weakened the economy. The loss of Venezuelan oil combined with the Trump administration's renewed pressure and isolationist policies created a perfect storm. Cuba's military, once the largest force projection capability of any developing nation, became a shell of its former self. Shortages reached crisis levels. The regime weakened by the month. From the Cuban Missile Crisis to military interventions across Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, Cuba spent decades punching far above its weight. A small island of 11 million people influenced world politics and inspired revolutionaries globally. But empires built on ideology and military adventures abroad, without economic foundation at home, eventually collapse. Cuba's story is a stark reminder of the limits of power projection when the homeland itself is failing.